Hello and welcome to the Florida Cable Telecommunications Association's Capital Dateline Online. I am once again joined by Jim Saunders, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida, and as always, I'm your host, Brad Swanson. Jim, welcome. All right, so we think things are quieting down with the holiday season, but that's not the case at all, right? We've got Enterprise Florida just named their new CEO, Chris Hart. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this has gotten a lot of attention because Chris Hart is a former legislator who's been the president of CareerSource Florida over the past several years, and he's, as you said, going to be the new president of Enterprise Florida. Enterprise Florida has been a pretty big issue in the legislature over the past year. Governor Scott has tried to use Enterprise Florida to recruit businesses from other parts of the country. And
every governor uses Enterprise Florida.
That is true.
Right.
But Governor Scott has wanted to put a lot of money into Enterprise Florida to recruit businesses from other parts of the country. And the legislature turned him down during the 2016 session when he was looking for $250 million. And he's back now wanting $85 million in the coming year for economic incentives that would flow through Enterprise Florida. It's going to be Chris Hart's job to try to navigate that through the legislature somehow. And the House leadership is very opposed to it.
But there's a caveat, because Chris Hart comes from the Speaker's neck of the woods. He's a former legislator. What else does he have going for him in there?
Well, I mean, those two things are two of his biggest selling points. I mean, he also, I think he just knows the system, knows the players.
Right.
As you indicated, he goes way back with House Speaker Richard Corcoran, who is the biggest opponent to spending money on economic incentives. Corcoran always talks about how that this is corporate welfare, essentially. And, you know, the House is the ones who blocked Scott's money this last time. So Chris Hart's going to have a lot of work to do to try to convince the House to go along. The governor's already, trying to build up the pressure a little bit to get some money. And he's got some apparent support in the Senate. But you know, it takes two to tango in the legislature. Chris Hart, I think you know him. I know him somewhat. He's a very amenable guy. He knows the system. So I think that's a contrast to his predecessor at EFI, who I think had a lot of had a lot of problems in terms of trying to navigate through that. Through the political thicket a little bit.
Yeah, I think from our perspective here, Chris Hart is just a known quantity within the system. I mean, former head of OTED when DEO used to be called OTED, Office of Tourism and Economic Development. So he understands the government's abilities and constraints from that part. Sissy Proctor now owns that. CareerSource Florida, it's the workforce and education organization for the state. And now he sits in the seat, and he's the former government affairs guy for Enterprise Florida as well.
Well, I think the other thing, I was thinking about this the other day. You know, he was in the Charlie Crist administration, and he survived that and went into the Rick Scott administration. There are not a lot of people who have had the political skills to navigate those two worlds, which are very different worlds.
Yeah, and you know, and he started out as a senator's staffer. And so the old adage is true in this game, which is be nice to all the staffers, because one day they're going to be your boss. So we'll stay tuned for what happens with Chris Hart and EFI. Should be interesting. All right, so the next big one was Governor Scott looking out for law enforcement across the state. He gave him a raise. What's happening?
He wants to give him a raise.
Right.
I mean, he made a proposal this week to give I believe it's a 5% pay raise to law enforcement state law enforcement officers. Now, this isn't a whole lot of money in this whole scheme of things. It's about, I think, $11.7–12 million, somewhere in that range. This would go to highway patrol officers and the law enforcement folks at the Department of Agriculture,
FWC,
and the fish and wildlife officers, those sorts of people. Governor Scott has made this one his initial budget proposal. Obviously, it's got political appeal. I mean, everybody likes to get in good with the law enforcement folks, but you know, we're going into a situation where it's going to be a tight budget year. Everybody thinks that. House Speaker Corcoran has said that the budget situation actually is more dire than the numbers we have seen, which those numbers essentially show flat revenue. And he's talking about a shortfall of hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, whether that will pan out or that will be the case remains to be seen. but dollars are going to be
Right.
pretty scarce in terms of doing new things. So,
But in the House, that was that situation. He had a little bit of support, at least on social media, from one key senator.
yeah, Jack Lavelle, there was some social media. Jack Lavelle is the new Senate Appropriations Chair, praised the governor for this proposal. One other supporter of it is Adam Putnam, who now, granted, some of his officers would get the money, so he's got a reason. But you know, everybody thinks Adam Putnam's running for governor. He's a pretty influential guy around town, and you know, his influence is gonna grow, I think, as that gubernatorial campaign gears up. And he came out pretty strongly in support of it too. Again, Corcoran, has talked about potential budget shortfall. His view is, if you're going to add spending in one place of the budget, you need to find cuts in some other place of the budget. Right. Now, the governor will propose a budget after the first of the year. The legislature will use that as a sort of a starting point. They can do anything it wants. So, and sometimes governors' budgets are not exactly, the math sometimes doesn't always work out.
Well, supporters of Speaker Corcoran will argue on his behalf and say that, some view the government in a stage of recovery, which is where we can start spending more. Some view that growth does not mean that you should be increasing salaries or expenses, because in good times you should be saving. And that seems to be where Speaker Corcoran's philosophical heart is, in good times we need to be saving, and in bad times that's where those rainy day funds, come from. So
well, it's clearly been a priority over the past several years to cut taxes as well. So you got to throw that into the mix. And the House has always been, pretty supportive of that. So there's a lot of different moving parts. This is just an initial budget proposal. We will see more from the governor over the next month or two. The way it's kind of worked in the past, he's dribbled out some of these high-profile proposals, like law enforcement salary increases, and then he comes out with a full budget proposal that then goes to the legislature.
Right. Well, CFO Atwater, the Florida Chamber, AIF will all note that while our population is the same size as New York, our budget is half the size of New York, and it's probably because we have hard discussions like this going on about where to cut, save, and spend. So we'll look for the legislature's move on that one. So it should be interesting. All right, so the next one, kind of not behind the scenes, but it's being heard and seen here. But the issue of guns and where guns are allowed in Florida is starting to come up, and we've had a dramatic change in the Senate with who chairs the committee that has been the stopping point for those issues in the past.
Yeah, I mean, during the 2016 session, this past session, the Senate blocked two major gun bills, one of which would allow people with concealed weapons licenses to carry on college and university campuses. The other one would allow them to carry openly in public. Those are issues that have popped up in other states and have been approved in a lot of other states. But the Senate blocked those during this past session, and the primary, or at least the figurehead of blocking that, was Senator Miguel Diaz de la Portilla, who was the Senate Judiciary Chairman. Senator Diaz de la Portilla lost his re-election campaign last month, and he is replaced on the Senate Judiciary Chairman by a new senator, Greg Steube, who just has happened to be one of the biggest gun rights supporters in the House over the past several years, and has sponsored some of this legislation that got killed last year. So Steube's appointment to that position has started this debate again, and I think we're going to see it. Now, whether these issues can get through the Senate, the full Senate, I don't know. It's way too early to know that for sure. But
I think the difference will be, though, is the Senate, it seems like it's more likely to at least have the discussion. Under the past year, it wouldn't even be allowed. It wasn't even allowed to be discussed.
They
did it in the House.
They died. They died without getting a full hearing in the Judiciary Committee. They got hearings in one other committee, but they didn't ever get up in Judiciary. So basically, they just were kind of stifled there.
Right.
If it gets to Steube's committee, he'll hear it.
Yeah.
So another thing to keep in mind: there are 20 new senators. A lot of them have moved up from the House. There's some others from the outside. But there's a lot of different dynamics in the Senate now than there used to be.
Yeah.
When people were in the Senate for long periods of time. We have half of the Senate is new. So there's going to be a lot of feeling out and a lot of new positions taken. But I think, for instance, Diaz de la Portilla's out, Stubbe's in. I mean, that's a very big big difference. No matter whether it's gun issues or other issues, they view life a little bit differently.
Yeah,
so.
well, campus carry, self-defense, folks that are opposed to guns going on to campus, it will definitely be interesting, and I doubt to a great degree that those proponents will stay home.
Well,
they'll be out in force.
Well, obviously, the NRA is a big supporter of these bills, but university administrators, presidents, police chiefs, so on, have been uniformly opposed to the campus carry bill. One wild card to watch in this is John Thrasher, the president of Florida State University, who is a former senator, a former House Speaker, opposes the campus carry bill, and he still has a lot of ties to the senators.
That's right. It should be interesting to see.
That's one thing to watch.
Yeah, he's always an influential figure wherever he goes. All right, so let's move from the Senate and the House on those issues and back onto the Judiciary. We saw the 3 recommendations go to the governor.
Yeah. Supreme Court Justice James Perry is retiring at the end of this month. So we are going to see an appointment to the Supreme Court, the first appointment by Governor Scott to the Supreme Court in his 6 years in office. So it's a big deal. A nominating commission this week sent him 3 names. Alan Lawson, who is the chief judge in the 5th District Court of Appeal, which does a lot of Central Florida cases. Wendy Berger, who's another judge on that Court of Appeals. And then Dan Gerber, who is a civil litigator in Orlando. So I think the key is that they're all very conservative. They have ties to the Federalist Society, and so Governor Scott's going to be able to appoint a conservative to the court to replace Justice Perry, who is pretty liberal, part of the liberal majority of that court at this point. And so there's going to be a big change there. Wendy Berger and Alan Lawson, I think, are more known commodities because they have been judges. There's going to be a lot of ability to look at how they've ruled on cases in the past, whereas Mr. Gerber is a litigator. I mean, he's an attorney, a practicing attorney as opposed to a judge. Wendy Berger, for instance, is also well known in Tallahassee. She worked for Jeb Bush. Yeah. She was one of his attorneys, worked a lot of death penalty cases. So there are 3 choices there. I think the only thing we know for sure right now is there's going to be a conservative going on that court.
Right. And I would say that just from the chatter around town, it sounds a little bit like the folks that would be more on the plaintiff side may not be celebrating as much as the folks that are on the business side with some of these cases that have played in those realms. But again, they're still in a minority regardless of who they put in there.
Well, they are, but when you got 7 members on that court and you change one, it makes a difference.
Right.
I mean, there are a lot of 5-2 decisions right now with a liberal 5, but there are also 4-3 decisions. So,
and when it's closer, there's that propensity for the swing vote being a greater fulcrum and a greater opportunity.
Well, and
to
there
go
may
either
be
way.
more need to compromise too. Right. So, the Supreme Court debates these cases in private, so you don't ever really know what all the personal dynamics are. But in a body that small, when you add one person, it can change the dynamics. So,
well, it's no Super Bowl, but policy wonks up here will be watching that like a hawk.
Well, so, as you alluded to, I think the biggest thing is going to be watching these civil cases and death penalty cases. Right. But this court has been favorable to plaintiffs in a lot of different situations, and not as favorable to business. And if that starts to change, it could have a big effect.
We might see some new tailgating happening outside of the Supreme Court. People waiting for decisions, and maybe not. All right, so let's bring it back home. Speaker Corcoran, as we've spoke about before, has a lot of different things. He's opened a new class over in the House. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, he is going to have a training class for lobbyists. So in the middle of December, he's got set aside a couple days to train them on his new rules, which have tried to add restrictions for lobbyists. There's just a lot of chatter around town about these rules anyway.
Right.
I mean, he's trying to, I mean, say lobbyists can't text legislators during meetings, and there's other things about disclosing information about what lobbyists are working on. So he has decided to have training sessions for lobbyists, which is sort of unusual. But
well, but you know, to the citizens' perspective, you know, he's giving voice to transparency is at least the argued goal there. But I'd say you've got, you know, professionals that have worked in this town that, you know, would argue that the system is as transparent as possible. But you know, is that the case?
I don't know. I tend to think that there's a lot of groaning among the lobbying corps right now about this going on. Because, you know, I mean, for one thing, there's a lot of lobbyists, and how do you train them all? But it's kind of like herding cats. They're pretty independent people as well. So,
well, you can log in and watch it online, and I'm betting that will be the option most chosen. But you never know. You never know.
Some of them like to show their face.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
so.
We'll see. We'll see. Well, that's all the time we have for today, Jim. Thanks so much for keeping us informed as to what's going on in Tallahassee, and we look forward to getting together with you soon.
Great.
Well, for more news, views, and opinions, go to our website at capitoldateline.online.com and hit us up on our Facebook page as well. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in.